Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Coexisting with Cougars, presented by Aaron Bott. Aaron is a wildlife biologist who has been working with NatHab since 2017. It's so great to have you with us today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. Howdy, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me and see me, and more importantly, see my presentation that should be up on your screens. I'm excited to talk to you all today about cougars and the science of coexisting with them in today's modern world. Again, like Kendall already said, hopefully at the end of this, we'll have some time for questions. So if you have any, you can write those in, and hopefully I'll be able to get to those before we're all through. Really quick, an introduction about myself. I'm a wildlife biologist. I specialize in large carnivores in North America. That means that I work with grizzly bears, wolves, and cougars. I graduated from Utah State University, earning a graduate degree working with Yellowstone National Park, studying and researching wolves in their southwestern interior. I live in the American West. I'm a Rocky Mountains kid. My family has been here for 7 generations, so I've had a lot of experience growing up in rural communities and working around people who love wildlife and sometimes have conflicts with wildlife. And that's how I decided to get into wildlife biology, specifically large carnivore conservation and management. If we can figure out how to coexist with cougars in our backyards and wolves and bears, then I think we'll be doing pretty good in terms of conservation on a grand scale. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's talk about the star of our show, the cougar, or PUMA concolor. Now the cougar, just to clarify, has more names than any other species according to the Guinness Book of World Records. There are 40 different names recognized for this animal. So you may be thinking, cougar, I didn't know that the cougar and the mountain lion were the same thing, or the puma and the cougar were the same thing. They are. It's the same species, PUMA concolor. Concolor meaning one color or same color. PUMA being a subgenus of the cat family. So we're going to talk a little bit today about this animal. I'll probably flop around in what I call the puma. I just did it right there. I'll probably call it the cougar sometimes. I'll probably call it a mountain lion. I'll probably call it a cougar, or excuse me, a puma. So hopefully you can stay with me and follow what I'm talking about. I like to call this animal a cougar rather than a mountain lion, just because the mountain lion gives this kind of connotation that this species belongs in the mountains, and it doesn't necessarily just live in the mountains. As we'll learn, this animal lives everywhere throughout the Americas, North, Central, and South America. And so I'd like to try and stick with the term cougar, but again, you can call it whatever you'd like from wherever you're at, whether it be a painter, a cat mount, anything works here. Quickly, we'll talk a little bit about the biology, the ecology, and the ethology of these incredible carnivores. Cougars have an incredible distribution across the Western Hemisphere. As I already mentioned, they live in North America, Central America, and South America. And because their range is so great, they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. So the weights and even the lifespans here that I'm about to present are not necessarily fixed or universal. The weights I have here listed are applicable to cougars in the Rocky Mountains. Males generally weigh between 120 to 170 pounds. That's average. Females are much smaller than the males, about 40 to 50% even less in weight than the males are. So females are 80 to 120 pounds on average. And again, this is the Rocky Mountain spectrum. So you can have cougars that weigh less than this and a lot more than this. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, the American president, was considered in his lifetime a cougar expert. He published scientific papers on the mountain lion and was famous for his passion to hunt these animals as well. And he actually was recorded taking a male, or a tom cougar, in Colorado in the early 1900s that weighed 227 pounds. So again, a lot of variation in size, but most of the males that we're looking at, again, 150 pounds is probably the average. The lifespan for males is 8 to 10 years, and for females is 12 to 14 years. These are the second largest cats in North America, actually the Americas at large. They're second to the jaguar. There are small populations of jaguars in Arizona and New Mexico. They come up from Central America. So the cougar does not technically classify as the largest cat in North America. Cougars are unique among some of their peers in the carnivore genus here in North America because they're able to reproduce at any time of the year. Grizzly bears and wolves are other two large carnivores that we have on the landscape. They have a designated breeding season and a designated whelping season when they give birth. For wolves, they breed in February, and 2 months later they'll give birth in April. For bears, they have this unique reproductive process known as delayed implantation. So they actually breed in the summertime, June and July, but the female will actually not give birth until January typically, after just a very short season when the embryo begins to gestate. But cougars, they're not regulated to a specific time of year when they can reproduce. So they have the fortune of being able to reproduce at any time of year. However, there are seasonal pulses that occur, meaning sometimes the conditions during the year are slightly more favorable for cougars to mate and reproduce and rear offspring. So although you could have a litter of kittens born at any time of year, generally here in the West, in the Rockies, we see a surge in cougar kittens, usually in the late summer, early fall. So right about now in September. Cougars, as I think we all are pretty familiar with or understand, like most cats, they're pretty much solitary, or at least they don't contribute to the development or growth of one another's offspring. So males typically do not rear their kittens or their offspring. The females are an exception where they'll take care of their own kittens, but they don't often interact with any other females. Males are polygamous, and so they'll go out and they have a territory where they range, they kill, they eat, and they establish their dominance on the landscape. And within their territory, there can be multiple females that have home ranges. There's a difference between a home range and a territory. Wolves, for example, are very territorial. They'll fight and kill for their territory. That's where their pack lives. Bears have home ranges, meaning they have an area that they frequent, and they often overlap with other bears. So female cougars have these home ranges. They can overlap with one or two other females in the area, and generally you have one large male, a breeding male, in the vicinity or in the territory that will frequent the different females and mate with them throughout the year. Females come into estrus just for a very short period of time. It's about a week long, 8 days, when they're receptive to breeding. And the males come and they court, they breed, and then 80 to 96 days later, you suddenly have these cute, cuddly kittens. Typically, you have 2 to 4 kittens born per litter. They come out like little fur balls, blind, but as soon as they open up their eyes, as soon as they start to develop their sense of sight, their eyes are this beautiful, almost livid blue, purple color, and that that coloration will eventually go away after a couple of months, and their eyes turn a really rich dark. The kittens are also born with spots and stripes, so they look almost like bobcats. People can get confused if they see cougar kittens out in the wild. It's rare because of how secretive these animals are, but it's possible that you could see one and maybe think that it's a bobcat. Those spots eventually go away after 6 months to even a year, just depending on the individual. They grow out of that baby coat and they develop that monochromatic upper coat, that pelage that is so uniform among mountain lions. Females will rear their young, they'll take care of their young for a year to a year and a half, after which time mom pushes them out the door, tells them to go on off to college, as it were, to go live on their own. And mom gets ready to have more kittens. So after about a year and a half, she'll enter estrus once more, and she'll be receptive for breeding, and the cycle starts all over again. So cougars have the greatest distribution of any terrestrial species in the Western Hemisphere. I have given presentations for Natural Habitat Adventures on wolves, and I've talked about how wolves have a tremendous distribution globally, perhaps the greatest distribution of any terrestrial species aside from humans. But cougars have definitely the largest here in the Americas, whereas wolves are what we call a whole Arctic species, meaning that they live above the equator in Europe and in Asia and in North America. Cougars actually live in North America, Central America, and South America. They do not extend into the old world, into Eurasia at all, but they do extend again down through Argentina, even into Chile. I think people don't realize that actually. They don't realize how great of a distribution this incredible animal has here in the Americas. Evolutionarily, cougars are a New World species. They did evolve in the Americas. And we believe from molecular testing and DNA sampling that cougars most likely developed in South America, where we can test their mitochondrial DNA and we can see that there's a lot of diversity and variance in the genotypes of these animals. And then they began to disperse and move northward. So probably the cradle of cougar evolution is in South America, and they've since distributed and moved north. There are 6 different subspecies of cougars, and basically everything north of Nicaragua is all one subspecies. This is an excellent map that was put out by Patagonia, the clothing company. I really like it and had to include it here because this shows you the historic range of mountain lions or cougars, and it shows you where they are today, and it also shows you sightings of cougars that have either been seen, documented, or tragically ended up usually as roadkill. Once upon a time, prior to Euro-American settlement, cougars lived all across North America, basically just below the boreal forest there. They don't go up into Alaska. They just hit the very southern tip of Alaska's coast. As climates are changing, as things are getting warmer, I think that we can expect over the next centuries that we'll see more cougars moving north up into Alaska. They're not the ideal snow creature. The pads on their feet don't make them as hardy in the winter as a wolf, for example. Nevertheless, they have an incredible distribution in a lot of snowy terrain here in the Rockies. With the advent of Euro-American settlement, people began to persecute cougars, and they eradicated them from the east. They trapped them and poisoned them, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, to the point where they were almost extinct. We had really dropped our population quite radically. But since then, the cougar has rebounded, and this is an incredible success story. And the Western population has naturally recolonized, and we can see cougars dispersing east Again, we've got cougars that are showing up in Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, even in New York. Something that is exciting for us as biologists to recognize is that cougars are very active on the landscape. They move at a rate greater and disperse at distances greater than we ever appreciated before. You can also see down here in the bottom right-hand corner of the map, we have the Florida panther, which is also a cougar, PUMA concolor. Most of you are probably familiar with the Florida panther, and I'm going to talk more about it later on in the slideshow. But they are unique because, unlike the rest of the East, they were not completely eradicated. In fact, they kept a tenacious hold on this small area of wilderness in the Everglades where they hung on, but they had a lot of problems, and they still do have a lot of problems, but we'll talk more about them later. But again, cougars are doing fantastic today. Their population has skyrocketed in the West. In fact, biologists estimate that the population in the American West is as high as it has ever been, even as high as when Lewis and Clark, the explorers, came out west. So we have approximately 300,000 cougars living in the American West, and this is an incredible success story. Cougars are the only large cat species in the world with an expanding population and range. Your jaguars, your cheetahs, your tigers, your lions, all of those other charismatic felids are tragically suffering. The populations are crashing. They're going slowly extinct unless we can change our methods of management and conservation. The cougar, however, it's a success story, and it's uplifting for that very reason. So cougars are doing well. I'd like to hit a little bit on the biology of the cougar and what makes it so special and adaptable as a carnivore. The cougar is very specialized at killing, very specialized as a hunter and as a predator. Again, I work a lot with wolves, and wolves sometimes get the rap of being very efficient as predators, and people, even wolf advocates, really like to emphasize just how great and how cool a pack of wolves hunting elk or bison is. In reality, wolves are not very great hunters. They're pretty awkward. It's a lot like seeing your German Shepherd or Golden Retriever in a pack go out and chase down a deer. They're capable of doing it, yes, but their success rate is not nearly as great as that of a cougar or a felid. And the reason for that is wolves don't have the specialized ability or the specialized skeletal structures that cougars do have. Wolves bite with their teeth, whereas you have cougars that have a shorter rostrum or a shorter snout, which gives them a more powerful bite than the wolf. They've got those large canines, which are used for biting typically into the neck of their prey. They're ambush predators, whereas wolves chase or are cursial. They run down their prey. Cougars have the ability to sneak up on their prey. That gives them the advantage of having a less discriminate prey selection. Wolves typically go for the weak or the injured or the old or the young. Cougars don't discriminate as much in terms of their prey. They go for what is there, and in that case, they can have a bigger impact on prey populations. They have these large eyes that sit at the front of their skull. They have, perhaps most importantly, supinating forelimbs, whereas a wolf has to run with its forelegs digging into the ground. The cougar, just like your cat at home or a tiger or a lion, has the ability to use its forelimbs as weapons. It can bat, it can reach out, it can grab. The retractable claws are not used for traction. They're used for tools of clutching, scratching, and killing, unlike a wolf's claws. They also have specialized carnassial teeth, whereas the wolf and the bear even has carnassials, those premolars back behind the canines that allow them to cut into meat. The cougars are even more serrated, and they lack a molar-like plateau. This means that they're obligate carnivores. They are only able to eat meat. They have to eat meat in order to survive. Wolves and bears can be slightly more omnivorous, just like your dog can eat some grains in the dog food that you give him. Your cat or the mountain lion is not capable of doing that. Now, if you haven't picked up on this yet, cougars are carnivores. I've mentioned that several times, but I'm mentioning it again here with its own slide because it's important to understand that carnivores can be challenging to live with. They are charismatic, and I specifically think that they're fascinating because of how stealthy they are, the amount of impact that they can have on their environment, the ecosystem. But a carnivore is defined as an animal that consumes flesh. And in order to survive, carnivores must kill and eat other animals. That's just the nature of it. So when we talk about conflicts with carnivores in just a few slides, it's important to realize that to be a carnivore comes with its pros ecologically, but it's not always the most popular thing, especially not among people. I really like this quote: despite being biological entities, large carnivores are almost entirely represented as symbols and emotions. We respond not so much to the carnivores themselves as to our own ideas of these creatures. Isn't that true? How many of us have ever seen a cougar or a mountain lion in the wild, or a lion or a tiger, or a bear or a wolf? And yet all of us have very passionate feelings and emotions that come to mind when we recall these animals. That's why you're here. I imagine you're interested in carnivores. That's why you decided to tune into this presentation today. So even if you've never interacted with a carnivore, you still have this idea that it represents some kind of symbol to you, a symbol of wilderness, or in some cases a symbol of fear or a symbol of hate. It's important to also understand that conflicts with large carnivores are as old as humanity. People have had problems with cougars in the 1800s and 1900s here in the Americas, but that's not a uniquely American issue. Wolves have been eradicated throughout most of their historic range through the British Isles, through Japan. Bears have been hunted and trapped out through most of Eurasia as well. We see a lot of complexity and conflicts taking place with Siberian tigers, with lions in Africa. So this issue where humans and carnivores conflict, I hope you understand, is not just a new American invention. Carnivores are dangerous, just like all wild animals. They are dangerous, and in some cases, they threaten our economy. Historically, they could threaten our lives more than they do today when their numbers were in greater abundance. And when we were out foraging on the landscape as hunters and gatherers, and psychologically, that's left an impression on us, and it's tough for some people to get over that. Things changed dramatically, though, in the 19th century when our technology allowed us to persecute carnivores at a rate greater than had ever been done before. We invented tools that helped us kill bears, wolves, and cougars that was unethical and wrong and quite frightening, but it was also very effective. So it's important to understand that killing predators wasn't new. We just got better at it. As Euro-Americans settled in the Americas, as they settled what became the United States of America, we had programs that eradicated cougars because we saw them as pests. We saw them as a threat to us as people. They're dangerous, like I mentioned, and they were a threat to our livestock and to our economy. And so all the way up into the 1900s, in fact, in 1915 to 1931, the US government created a system where people could go out and shoot and kill animals, cougars specifically, but also bears and wolves, and they would receive a bounty on those animals. I also want to point out too that while of course this is tragic, we didn't know any better. We were dumb. perhaps some of us as individuals recognized that this was morally wrong, but the country and peoples everywhere were pretty caught up in it. This gentleman here on the right-hand side of this photo, that's Theodore Roosevelt. He was an advocate for hunting, and he liked to participate in cougar hunts and pursuits. I already mentioned that he thought the cougar was a fascinating animal, and in his day and age, if you wanted to study an animal as a naturalist or as a biologist, you'd track it down and you'd shoot it. It's just the way of the world back then. And tragically, we eradicated most cougars from the historic range. And we went from having tens of thousands of cougars in the United States, in North America, to probably just a few hundreds, probably in the 1,000 to 1,400 is what some historians estimate we got as low as. Now, one thing that was advantageous for the cougar compared to the wolf, which we did systematically eradicate throughout all of its historic range in the US, with the exception of a small population in the Great Lakes, is cougars are more cryptic. They're more secretive. And so small populations could still be found throughout the American West, despite our systematic persecution of this animal. Because of their nature, they don't like to scavenge as much as wolves and bears do. And one of the great and terrible tools that we used against these animals was poisoning meat and leaving it out, placing meat and leaving it out for wolves and bears to come eat and then consume and die. Cougars avoid that more than those other species. Plus, they live in very difficult places to get to. So because of their resilience due to their secretive and solitary behavior, the eradication efforts did not prove successful. Thank goodness. We got close, but things began to change. It really started with a movement at the same time that this persecution was taking place, where we were trying to systematically eradicate a lot of predators. Individuals, professionals, biologists, they questioned the system, and they thought that we were doing things incorrectly. This is Aldo Leopold, who's considered the father of modern wildlife management. As a young man, he was hired to eradicate predators, and as he got older, he began to understand that there's an intricacy in the makeup of the ecology of the landscape, and he questioned our reasoning for trying to eradicate these animals. And he eventually changed his tune and became a very severe critic of predator eradication. This is a lovely quote I always like to share from his journal, from his story in Thinking Like a Mountain. He's talking about, as a young man, he was out hunting wolves, and he reached the old wolf that he had shot just in time to watch the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. He was young, and he was full of trigger itch. And I thought, because fewer wolves meant more deer, then no wolves would mean a hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. It's very poetic. But with Aldo Leopold, came this transition in the American mind, where we began to think more about how we should manage our wildlife populations and how we should perhaps restore predators that had been removed from the landscape. Now, ironically, and whether you agree with this or not, that's up for you to decide, but I'm just here to explain the history. The saving grace for cougars was actually hunting. Prior to the 1960s, throughout the West, cougars, what was left of them, were considered vermin, and they could be shot on sight. In some cases, you'd still receive a bounty for them. But in the 1960s, hunters specifically, began to appreciate the pursuit of these animals. And the reason why people like deer and elk so much is because they place a value on them. And in the hunter's mind, the value comes with the idea of the pursuit and the consumption of the meat. Sportsmen in the 1960s began to say, hey, it's kind of fun to hunt cougars, and I don't want them to be eradicated. And so they began to lobby and push for state wildlife management agencies to protect cougars and to regulate cougar hunting and killing, and to ban killing cougars at certain times of the year, and to ban killing kittens, etc., and to ban killing females in some instances. So as this gained traction, as people began to enjoy recreational pursuits of cougars, the cougar population began to benefit from it. No longer was it legal just to shoot a cougar on sight. If you did so, you'd be fined. You'd have your hunting rights taken away. And so with this hunting push, cougars ironically began to come back. And it promoted population growth, and soon cougars began to recolonize areas that they had been eliminated from. So whereas wolves and grizzly bears were listed as an endangered species, cougars were never actually listed as an endangered species, but due to a change in value and a change in management, the populations began to rebound. And because they can breed at any time of the year, and they typically have 2 to 4 kittens, the population bounced back relatively quickly. This is a great shot taken from Yellowstone showing the interaction between wolves and cougars on the landscape. And I'd like to talk just for a second a little bit about the ecology and the benefits of having predators on the landscape. Most of us are familiar with trophic cascades, this idea where you take a predator away from the landscape and you have the prey base, your herbivores, your deer, and they eat themselves out of house and home. They eat too many plants and it destroys the environment, and eventually the deer population crashes. This top-down perception of having an important predator which regulates the deer population, and therefore everything stays in a beautiful balance. That trophic cascade theory is very important in terms of ecology, and restoring a predator to the landscape did help shape the environment. This is a graph showing the northern elk herd in Yellowstone National Park after wolves and cougars had been eradicated from Yellowstone National Park. You can see in the 1960s the elk population began to skyrocket, and then we reintroduced the wolf in the mid-90s, and at the same time cougars began to naturally recolonize in Yellowstone. People don't realize that cougars had been eliminated from Yellowstone just like the wolf, but naturally they recolonized. The grizzly bear population grew, and we also included more hunting permits outside of Yellowstone National Park. Humans are carnivores too, and so we have an impact on the game herds, or the elk herds in this situation. So trophic cascades, it's an intricate web of an ecological vitality. It's really important to have predators on the landscape because they regulate the herbivores. It's been oversimplified and kind of overplayed a little bit in popular literature and popular magazines talking about the effects of restoring wolves to Yellowstone National Park. I talk more about this in my large carnivores presentation that I gave with Natural Habitat Adventures, and my grizzly bears presentation, but it's more than just the wolf. It's a complex suite of conditions that keep the environment healthy. And cougars, perhaps more than wolves and more than grizzly bears, are your predator that is impacting elk and deer populations. Wolves, for example, have a kill success rate of with elk of about 19 to 20%. And cougars, it's much higher, 50 to 60% in some cases. Again, cougars are very efficient predators. A male cougar typically kills an elk once a week. A female with kittens will make a kill of a deer or an elk as frequently as every 3 days. So they can definitely make an impact on your herbivore community, your prey community. This is a graph showing Yellowstone National Park's study of cougars and what they're consuming from 1998 to 2005. You can see that the majority of the food that these animals are eating, that cougars are eating, is primarily elk. That's the highest density of prey species that we have in Yellowstone National Park. Cougars do really well with elk. They also do really well with deer, with bighorn sheep, and even mountain goats, depending on the populations that are in the areas where these large cats range. Cougars, as I mentioned, they're extremely efficient predators, and they're capable of impacting their prey, the populations on a grand scale and sometimes in a negative scale too. In biology, we have what's called additive predation and compensatory predation. Compensatory predation is what you would typically think of when you imagine the perfect circle of life. You have predators impacting an elk herd by eating only the sick, the old, or the young. That's typically how predation works. But there are cases where you have struggling prey populations in a larger predator population. When that happens, it's called additive predation, and you can have more cougars, for example, than you have deer. And if you have more cougars than you have deer, then that cougar population is negatively or adversely going to affect that deer population. This has been interesting to see because in studying cougars in Yellowstone National Park, we've come to appreciate the frequency in which these animals are killing deer and killing elk. But they're not very successful in retaining what they kill. So a cougar might make more kills in a month than a pack of wolves, but the wolves will go in and they'll drive the cougar off of its kill, which means the cougar has to then kill more frequently than it normally would without wolves on the landscape. In areas where you don't have wolves or grizzly bears to drive cougars away from their kills, cougars are taking advantage of that. And in doing so, they can threaten populations of herbivores that are struggling. Most popularly known is the bighorn sheep in Nevada. There are populations of bighorn sheep that are really struggling. In fact, they've been listed as endangered, as distinct populations. And the cougars are doing great because there's a lot of deer. And so the cougars are able to eat deer, and they're also able to eat the bighorn sheep. And the consumption of the bighorn sheep population, which is struggling, which is trying to make a living and not doing very well due to illness, it can be challenging to try and manage and understand the complexities of the environment. Due to their elusive behavior, cougars are tough to work with. They're tough to monitor and to research. They are the hide and seek champions of the world. They like to stay away from people, or stay out of sight of people, more importantly. So we can have cougars in our backyards, but never know it because they're so good at staying away and keeping to themselves. And so as researchers trying to monitor and manage and understand their populations and their growth and their expansion and their reproductive cycles, it can be tough. So as part of my job, we begin to appreciate and understand cougar populations by first going to where they live. And in the Southwest, which is an area that I work, we have to go into the cliffs and canyons to locate some of the species that these cougars are consuming and killing. This is the remains of a stashed bighorn sheep. You can see the radio collar in the background. And when the collar goes into a mortality mode, we go and investigate. And at this particular site, we found a large female mountain lion that had killed and stashed this bighorn sheep, as well as its baby. We later go in to research these animals, and we typically will use hounds to pursue the animals, to pursue cougars, and we tree the cougar, and then we'll dart it and lower it down out of the tree by placing a harness around the animal, which means one of us has to climb up into the tree. We lower the cougar down, and we test its health. We check for parasites. We test its blood. We want to make sure that the animals and the population of these fantastic creatures is doing well. And we also like to understand the success rate of kills that these animals are making. How frequently are they killing their prey? Are they able to survive without conflicting with humans and with other predators and with other cougars as well? Cougars are very violent towards other cougars. Males very commonly will kill other kittens in an area. They're defensive. They fight and they kill one another for territory and for their mates. I threw this in really quick, these next two slides, to talk about the Florida panther and to answer some questions about the cougar population out east. So as we've been going through these slides, I've been talking a lot about cougars in the American West and how they're recovering, how they're doing well. In the east, if you're familiar with the Florida panther, that small population that was left alone in the Everglades began to struggle in the 1970s, actually before that, 1950s, 1960s, and in the 1970s it was finally listed as a species that needed protection by the Environmental Species Act. The problem with cougars there was they lacked genetic diversity, and so the population got so small, probably down into the 20s, and they didn't have any neighboring cougars to breed with, that they began to inbreed, and this caused a lot of problems. So in the 1990s, we captured some cougars from Texas and introduced them to the population there in Florida, and immediately we've been seeing a lot of turnaround, a lot of great success with the diversity of the cougar population growing there. The current population is 120 to 130. We'd like to see that population grow to at least 3 different populations of 240 individuals, excluding dependent age kittens. So this is going to require land outside of the state of Florida. One of the big issues with cougars in our modern world and coexisting with them is finding a place for these animals to live. The state of Florida is an apt location to emphasize because it has a high human population. And humans, whether they're intending it or not, they overlap and they can encroach on cougar habitat and cougar resources. More often than not, the endangered Florida panther is killed when it's trying to cross the road. As we fragment these habitats, it becomes more and more difficult for populations to continue to expand and to continue to grow. When cougar kittens become old enough, they eventually will disperse or leave their mother to go out on their own and to set up their own home range or their own territory. We call these transients. Transient individuals are more likely to become involved in depredation of livestock. They're going to get into trouble on some ranchers' fields, killing their sheep or killing their goats or killing their cattle, or they're more likely to come into areas of conflict with humans in towns, in urban areas, while they're attempting to locate food without the advantage of an established home range. So when you hear of cougars that are getting into trouble in neighborhoods, it's usually a transient male. It could be a female as well, but often a male that's trying to eke out a living. But as a teenager, you could say, it's not very good at figuring out how to live and how to make life easy. But as a lot of us are familiar with, a lot of our towns are pretty popular with other species of wildlife, particularly deer. There's some mule deer in town. I think most of us have heard stories or even are personally familiar with having deer eating your tulips, your vegetable garden in town. And this can be problematic because cougars need deer to live, and they aren't as shy of humans and civilization as we might expect. I gave a presentation again for Natural Habitat Ventures on coexisting with large carnivores, and I talk a little bit about cougars in that presentation. Feel free to go back and watch that because I am going to just touch on some of the coexistence issues that we have, and you can watch that previous presentation if you're more interested. But by creating habitat that is suitable for deer, we're also creating habitat that is suitable for animals that eat deer. It's kind of crazy because we think of cougars as being the symbol of wilderness. It belongs in the mountains, it belongs in the forests. But in reality, the cougar just needs to keep its belly full. And that means it's sometimes going to come into areas where we as people might not be comfortable having that animal. It's true, the city was once wilderness, and it used to be the home of the mountain lion. It used to be the home of the wolf. It used to be the home of the grizzly bear. But we've changed that, and it's difficult to find what we call ecotones, which is an environment or a habitat in between city and wilderness where we can have this overlap and we can have these species coexist with us peacefully. By having these predators in our backyards, we sometimes have these tragic stories. Is this the price of coexistence? I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with the expansion of coyotes across North America, or coyotes, we call them coyotes out west. But you hear stories about people being attacked or their dogs or their cats going missing by coyotes. The same thing happens with cougars. Cougars will go out into people's backyards and they'll kill their dogs or they'll kill their cats. This brings up a really difficult moral dilemma that I don't have the answer to, and I just encourage you as a listener to think about where do we draw the line? At what point is it okay for us to say we shouldn't have cougars here? We shouldn't have them in Denver. It's not necessarily safe. It's not good for our pets, and in some cases, it's not good for the safety of people. The probability of predation as the cause of human death is extremely minuscule. Cougars rarely attack people. They rarely kill people, but they are dangerous animals, and they make their living by hunting and by killing. And as the cougar population continues to grow, and as more people continue to expand where we recreate, I think it's unfortunately realistic to say that we could see more interactions, and some of those could lead into mortality, and people can die, and cougars can, of course, die as well from these tragic interactions. So we have to begin to ask ourselves, where is it okay for us to have these animals? Where is it okay for us to overlap? And what activities and behaviors are we willing to change as people? It's a big fad right now for us to get out in the woods, to go and play in the mountains, for us to mountain bike, to trail run. That's the home of the mountain lion. That's the home of the wolf and the bear. And as we go out and recreate, we need to have discussions to decide what we should do and where we should do it, and if it's okay that we are doing it, or if we shouldn't do it at all. So as we go out mountain biking, as we go out trail running, we need to ask ourselves, should we be doing this here? Should I be doing this in grizzly bear habitat or in mountain lion habitat? What level of risk as a society, are we okay with? And if an interaction, a negative encounter happens, who's going to be held accountable? Is it going to be the individual, the person who was recreating? Is it going to be the government agency that was responsible for managing wildlife populations, or the recreationist park? Or is it going to be the animal? And as kind of a hint, not everyone's going to agree with this. Not everyone's going to agree with your beliefs, and you're not going to agree with everyone else's beliefs. But these are some of the discussions that we need to have when it comes to coexisting with these animals. I want to emphasize again what's been happening in Florida with the Florida panther and its struggle to bounce back from endangered status is a loss of habitat. The loss of habitat throughout the Americas, but especially here in the American West, is very alarming. Aside from climate change, I think it is the most destructive thing that we have on the table right now in terms of large carnivore conservation and wildlife conservation at large. Our wilderness areas are shrinking. In fact, in the lower 48 states, the most wild area is in Yellowstone National Park. It's designated as the most remote corner in the lower 48 states because it's 20 miles from a road. Only 20 miles. The most remote area in the lower 48 states is only 20 miles from a road. That's something to think about. And as wilderness areas are shrinking, large carnivore populations are going to continue to bump into us. As our population as a species continues to grow, we're going to continue to bump into these animals. This is tragically a cougar that I picked up on the side of the road that had been hit by a car. We got to think, how are we going to coexist with these animals? What areas can we designate for them and for their use, and how can we behave better as recreationists in their habitat? I also wanted to point out, as a biologist, I'm often confronted with people who don't like the idea of having animals in towns get euthanized or be killed, and I'm not comfortable with that either. But as habitat, as wild areas are shrinking in size, we need to realize that relocation is not necessarily a solution. We recently radio collared a cougar in central Utah, and within 2 months it had gone all the way up to Montana. These animals move. It's what they were born to do. They move. And so what areas do we have left where we could capture and relocate an animal where it's not going to get back into problems again, not get back into trouble? These are questions, again, that deserve a lot of our attention, but cougars are a fantastic animal, and I think the point that I'd like you all to take away from this is the resilience that this species has had in a world where we're hearing so many negative things taking place in the environment. The cougar has rebounded. The management of the cougar has helped the population grow and become more prolific throughout the American West. Going back to that map that I showed you earlier, you can see how its range is expanding and how its territories are expanding and how the numbers of cougars are expanding. We still have battles to fight in Central and South America where these animals are persecuted without regulation. But wow, in a world where you get on the news and you listen to the tragedy that's taking place with tigers out in Asia or lions in Africa, here is a large carnivore that is taking care of itself pretty much, and it's come back from the brink of extinction really on its own, and that's something that's remarkable. With that, I hope I was able to educate you a little bit on mountain lions, on cougars, on pumas, whatever you want to call them, and thank you guys for tuning in.
Thanks, Aaron. That was great. We do have lots of questions for you, and I'd like to remind folks that if you have a question for Aaron, you can submit that in the questions field in your control panel. All right, first question is, why are there so many names for a cougar?
Good question. There are so many names because so many different peoples have bumped into them. So if you're from Tennessee, if you're from California, if you're from the Shoshone tribe, if you're from a Mayan people in Nicaragua, all these different peoples just have different names that they like to call the animal, and for whatever reason, all those different names have stuck. So.
Okay, the next question's been pretty popular and towards the end of your presentation. How do you, or do you have any tips, how do you, when you're encountered by a cougar, if you're out on a trail, how do you react? What do you do? Does bear spray work?
That's a really good question, and I wish I would have included a slide, so I'm glad that people asked that. So cougars are ambush predators. It's good to go hiking with a dog because for whatever reason, cats and dogs don't get along. So have a dog and that can keep you safe. Don't move fast and quietly in cougar habitat. Don't ever run away from a cougar if you are encountered by one. They have that predator-prey drive. So if you run from a cougar, that cougar will probably go after you. If you see a cougar, or if unfortunately you are attacked by a cougar, you need to fight back. You need to fight back as hard as you can. And that animal, being a cat, they have a tendency to not like confrontation. And if you fight back, then in most cases, the cougar will flee. Bear spray has not been proven to be effective on cougars 100% of the time, but I would not hesitate to bear spray a cougar if one was acting aggressively towards me. If I was encountered by a moose that was charging me and I had bear spray, I would probably discharge it. I'd probably spray that moose. It's potent stuff. So if you've got a can of it, why not use it on a cougar? But again, it helps if you're in groups of 3 or more. That seems to be the magic number when being in carnivore country. Make noise, talk with each other, run, laugh, enjoy one another's company out loud. And if you are attacked by a cougar, or if a cougar is approaching you in a malicious way that makes you uncomfortable, then make yourself big, yell, throw rocks at it, act aggressively, or fight it, and the cougar should flee.
Okay, great advice. What predation are cougars subject to, particularly the kittens?
So cougars kill cougar kittens, unfortunately. We do document cannibalism on occasion, but at the very least, infanticide is pretty popular. So it's the #1 killer of cougar kittens is other cougars.
Is that to do with males killing other males' offspring for genetic purposes?
Yeah, so one of the reasons they might kill kittens is to bring the female into heat again, to make her receptive to breeding. But also it has to do with competition in the long run. That kitten in a year or 2 might be bigger and stronger than that male, and it might pose a threat to its security.
Very interesting. And do cougars and grizzlies complement or conflict with each other in ecosystems where their ranges overlap?
Cougars do hard work, and grizzly bears are lazy. I like grizzly bears, but grizzly bears are lazy, and they will scavenge or raid the kills that cougars have made. So cougars are generally not scavengers. They are the ideal hunter, and grizzly bears are much bigger and meaner, and they bully cougars away from their kills.
And earlier in the presentation, you had a photo from Yellowstone of the wolves and the cougar feeding together. How often does that happen? Is that pretty rare, or do they often share?
That was a snapshot. So the cougar had made the kill. That was a mule deer, if I am recollecting properly. And the wolves moved in, and the cougar did not want to let go of what it had worked hard to earn. But eventually that cougar did leave as more wolves came to the kill site. There's a recent book published by Tony Ruth and the Hornacher Institute, which is a very in-depth study on the impact of cougars and wolves in Yellowstone National Park. I believe the book is called Yellowstone Cougars. It's not a light read, it's a textbook style, but it's studying the interaction of wolves and cougars on the landscape. And what we found is kind of what you would guess, that wolves take advantage of the hard work that cougars put into killing their prey, which means cougars end up having to kill more in order to survive, in order to feed their own.
And do you have any information on the status of the underpasses that they're building in Florida for the wildlife?
Not particularly in Florida, but we have been installing a bunch here in the Rockies. We've put some in Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah recently, and we've been documenting a lot of different animals using those corridors, those culvert tunnels, or those overpasses, and we get cougars using them frequently. It's quite exciting. The more we can do to protect animals from getting hit by vehicles, the better. That's whether it's deer, grizzly bears, cougars, all those species are impacted severely by automobile collisions.
All right, well, it's the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to you, Aaron, for some closing comments.
Well, thank you guys very much. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that I answered some of your questions. It's always better to meet in person and to see your faces and to answer your questions right away. Hopefully I got to some of them. Cougars, again, are fantastic animals. They're remarkable, and what a success story. I think that the biology of this animal has definitely helped its recovery. But I also do want to say that thanks to groups like the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, state wildlife agencies, federal wildlife agencies, I think humanity can pat itself on the back and say, hey, we've come a long way from 1900. We're understanding how important these predators are on the landscape. We're doing a lot of good here, and thank goodness we've got cougars back out there. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great to end the week on a positive note. So thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We do have the lineup on our website at nethab.com/webinars now for next week, and be sure to keep an eye out for our Sunday email announcement. And please do note that we are off on Monday for the holiday. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.